inspiration from all sorts of sources. The lingering tales from the ancient past can be rich for reinterpretation and new exploration. Our panel discusses their own fictional mythologies and some of the real-world elements they researched. So I will ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves just before we kick off. My name is Charlotte Bond. I'm an author, editor, reviewer and podcaster. I co-host the podcast Breaking the Glass Slipper, and you might have seen some of our guests on it. Next year I have out 2 novellas from Tor.com which deal with dragons and death. More death in the second one, but slightly different death in the second one. I appreciate I'm not selling it that well. And that's why I'm here to talk about mythologies, and I'm very excited because we've got some fantastic people lined up for you. So, we'll start with you, if you'd be kind enough to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Alexander Glass. I'm mainly a short story writer, although there's other stuff in the pipeline not to be spoken about yet. My connection is I'm writing a sequence of AI-related mythology short stories in Asimov's, in Interzone, possibly elsewhere. I'm also doing a series for Interzone on Roger Zelazny, who obviously combines mythology and science fiction and other stuff.
That sounds really cool. Hi, I'm Tasha Suri, and I write fantasy, epic fantasy, things like The Jasmine Throne and Empress, and some of my books. And I largely draw on things like South Asian mythology in general, but specifically Hindu mythology from Hindu belief.
Hi there, I'm Joanne Harris. I write on Norse mythology, about which I've taken a lot of liberties, and also I've done some retellings of some old ballads, some child ballads. So I've had a lot of fun doing that, but all my other mainstream stuff is kind of mythology based as well in a lot of ways.
Hi, I'm A.Y. Chao. I write fantasy. My debut, Shanghai Immortal, came out earlier this year. And I draw on Chinese mythology and folklore, mainly China and Taiwan influenced Chinese mythology.
So I thought we'd start off by asking a question that I'm not necessarily sure I have a straightforward answer to. But what is the difference between a mythology and a religion? Or is there no difference at all? Anyone care to jump in there? I'll pick on someone if you don't jump in.
I'm curious to see who you'll pick on, actually.
Well, I'm going to pick on you, Tasha.
I'd be curious to hear what everybody else thinks. But I think the big difference between a mythology and a religion is that somebody says a religion is real and no one is saying mythology is, largely.
I wondered if it was time as well. Like, you have Greek mythology and people don't necessarily believe in the Greeks today, but they believe in Christianity and Hinduism. Does that mean that they are mythology? But then you have Christian mythology, so I don't quite know where you draw the line.
And you have Hellenistic pagans as well, of course. So for them, the mythology, Greek mythology, is not mythology; it's religion.
Yeah.
Probably you can disagree. I'm sure.
I think it depends on who's saying it, like who's deciding. So a lot of mythologies are mythologies now, but they were religious beliefs at one point. And even some mythologies, like I talk about Chinese mythologies, but a lot of the gods in my mythologies are actually actively being worshipped right now. So they are religious or religions, multi-deity religions. What is it?
Polytheistic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I'm an atheist, so to me, I think it's mythology, but people who believe will not agree with me.
When I was researching dragons, it was like mythology seems to be the demons and the stories that you don't necessarily believe in now. So the religion part is the bit that is true, that you worship, that you incorporate into your rituals, that you believe. But then the mythology is all the extra bits and the stories over time that people seem to have discounted. I think my favourite one when I was researching was when I was looking into underworlds, and I found a story about how the devil got really scared because Jesus was literally going to come down and kick his ass in hell. And he had a load of saints down there, and they were sort of saying, "Oh yeah, Jesus is coming down. He's gonna get you." And I was kind of like, "Well, is this mythology or is it religion?" Because it kind of involves, you know, the people that we know from religion, but at the same time, it's kind of got this fantastical element and this almost, action movie kind of element to it, but it was still part of the religion at the time. It's difficult to draw a line. I don't know that there is a line at all.
No, religion has a long tail. You can have something that was believed at a certain point, which is no longer believed by most people. So you have a sort of separation between the people who still believe in it, who might believe in it in a different way to the way they did 1,000 years ago. And then you have the people who don't believe in it, who go, yes, it's mythology. And it's a complicated conversation, because some of it's colonial, isn't it? We have a tendency from where we stand to look at other people's beliefs and go, well, these are pagan beliefs and these are mythological beliefs. But we sort of forget that at a certain time in history that wouldn't have been the case. They would have been believed, but whether they were believed on the same level that they're believed now is a different thing. Look at a popular mythology like Christianity, for instance. Look at the way people believe in Christianity in all their different ways. Now all around the world people believe in the physical devil, or they go, well, that's just a metaphor, or they believe in the virgin birth, or they believe in transubstantiation. And other people go, well, no, that's just a story, isn't it? But we believe in the rest of it. The rest of it's faith. And so you've got all these little intersecting bubbles of thought. And what do they make?
There's a really good book about Christianity, if you want to read about Christianity as something that... So, on a slight tangent, I think often we think of religion as this is the way and this is the right story. And mythology is there are many different versions of this story. But actually, looking at the history of Christianity even, the book by Dermot McCulloch is a really good one to have a look at. It's about as big as the power of the orange tree, so it's not too bad. It explores the different shapes that Christianity has taken throughout history in different cultural and historical contexts. And you do see that it's shifted and changed, and that there are huge disagreements about things. Even today, there's a whole theological discussion about Mary Magdalene and what her significance was, and mistranslation of her meaning in the story, and I won't go into that. And I think that I don't know what I think actually. I think that you should read that book, it's good.
It sounds great, but it's also, I think, you're also describing the fact that mythologies intersect and religions intersect, and nothing just comes from nowhere. So if you look at Christianity, and you also look at something like the Mithras cult, which very much intersect. You've got a god who is the son of a virgin, whose name was Myrrha, who was born in a cave, and wise men came to see him. And you're thinking, okay, have we heard this somewhere before? And then you go back to something like the Osiris cult, which is even older. And here you've got a corn god sacrificed at Easter who comes back from the dead, and his mother happens to be a virgin. And you go, okay, could they possibly be related? And so there is this kind of waveform of beliefs, and you can tell that people all around the world have been communicating with each other in little slices of information. I mean, I did something at the British Museum not too long ago on the Viking exhibition, because I happen to like Vikings, and I was looking at an exhibition that was very much about Vikings as great travellers. And we've got this idea that the Vikings had their belief and they just stuck to it. They did not. They went native all over the place, and they brought stuff back. And there was a wonderful 6th century carving that showed Jesus on the cross, and he had Thor's hammer under his arm. And you could just tell. Imagine the conversation here. You've got the Christianization of Scandinavia happening here, and you've got the warlord trying to persuade his people who have been worshipping Thor for some time that perhaps it's time they moved on. And he is not telling them a crucifixion story. He's going, yeah, Christ, he got off that cross and he just beat the crap out of them with his hammer. Because that would be the way he would feed them that narrative. You can just tell from the engraving that was what was going on. So was it belief? Was it faith? Was it mythology? Was it something else? Was it all of them?
I love that the Romans did something similar, and it's really interesting because I have an 11-year-old who's just discovering Greek mythology, and she wants to go to Bath. Bath. I'm not going to get into trouble which way I say it. But we were talking about the fact that the Romans turned up and they had Aqua Sulis as their goddess, and they went, it's pretty much like our goddess Minerva. Well, we'll just call it Sulis Minerva for a bit, and then just merge them. And I looked at my daughter's face and she's like, wow, that's clever. And I'm like, I know. But when you sort of describe it in later times, it seems it seems very detached and very sensible and coldly logical, but at the time, like you say, there was so much crossover that it probably worked, and you don't know where to draw the line. Well, I'm conscious that we could go on for hours about this, and I really wanted to talk to you about your books, in particular. That's what I think everyone's here to talk about. So, which mythologies have you incorporated into your work, and in particular, which elements did you add in? But I'm also quite interested to know which elements you left out and why. So can I start with you, Alexander?
Can I, before I get into that, just want to pick up a couple of things. That's an amazing story about Jesus coming off the cross and beating stuff. It reminds me, I don't know if people know Lean Times in Lankmar, the Fritz Leimer story. That is incorporated in there. I didn't realise that was a thing. That's clearly where he got that idea from. Also, the crossover thing. I don't know what year it is, but I remember there's a Viking burial mound which was excavated, and in which they found a Buddha figurine, which is wonderful. Probably, I imagine, from Byzantium, but the degree of crossover is obviously much greater than this.
No, I'm just imagining a story where Buddha's hitting somebody with a hammer.
Yeah. Viking Buddha has got to be a thing. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, also, sorry, the Rome thing. There's the pantheistic thing means that at some point, because Christians in the Roman Empire refused to go along with that, Christians were referred to as essentially atheists by the rest of the Romans. So Christians were the first atheists. That's quite interesting. Okay, so types of mythology. I take a really broad view about what mythology is, and so I think you can have a developing mythology of the Western, for example, and you can see things like Unforgiven and digging into what is the developing mythology of the Western. You can have mythology of the mafia. I think sort of, it's not, gangster movies not really something I get into deeply, but you know the thing about real mafiosi emulating The Godfather after The Godfather came out, so they're sort of mythologizing themselves, and I'm quite interested in the self-mythologizing process and the generation of mythology, and so the series I'm particularly working on is if you have machine consciousness, what kind of mythology are they going to develop, and where is it going to come from, and how is it going to develop?
That's great. You were definitely thinking
I was
about
pondering
that.
that. Yeah, I think self-mythologizing is a really interesting concept, and how it ties into things like propaganda and nationalism. Probably would quite fascinating. Not my topic though. So I draw on, like I said, South Asian mythology, particularly Hindu mythology. So I liked to draw on things like I think in The Jasmine Throne, which was one of my more recent books, I drew really heavily from the Mahabharata, which is a pretty common source to draw from because it's very big, very complicated, a lot of backstabbing. The Kardashians have nothing on it. And it was a really good source of inspiration in terms of writing a political, a war between siblings for a throne. It's a very good source for that because it had a lot of people warring for thrones and betraying each other. What I don't draw on particularly is the actual gods. And I don't do that partly because that feels internally for me like crossing a line into religion, to go back, to circle things back a little bit, because those are symbols that are still worshipped, or personifications that are still worshipped. Now I think I could do that, and that would be fine, because people should be able to do that. I don't actually think that religion shouldn't be questioned or investigated or ripped apart and examined. That's what fiction's for, but it's not really the point of what I'm doing. I'm much more interested in the kind of narratives of the Mahabharata, the symbolism, the way that symbolism has echoed into how we view women today, particularly, and that's what I want to focus on. So that's the approach I've taken.
I think that's really interesting. I've been thinking about what you were saying about mythologizing of human narratives, and I think perhaps what I think now, to answer your very first question, I'll get to this one in a minute, is that perhaps for me then, mythology is the stories that we tell about ourselves. and religion is the stories that we tell about the divine. And given that pretty much everything is filtered through our experience of ourselves, perhaps everything comes down to mythological narratives in one way or another, and it's about human beings trying to understand their place in the universe. So that's interesting, and I hadn't thought of that before, so thank you. So what I write about, I write a lot about Norse myths, and one of my things about Norse myths is that we don't know what they were, because there was an oral tradition, and the oral tradition was different depending on who was speaking to whom, and then we got good old Snorri who wrote it down from a very Christian perspective, and it was fine. We're grateful for him because he saved a lot of those stories that might not have been passed on at all. But he was already writing fanfic. He was already reinterpreting those stories to fit his own agenda of Christianization and order. And so we don't really know what the original, if we can say anything is original from the oral tradition, could have been. And so what I tried to do was to take that grandiose, heroic mythologizing that is so typical of Snorri and the people who came after him, and try to subvert it and take it back to a vernacular, which I modernized because actually nobody speaks like they did in the 12th century anymore, and that wouldn't have worked. So I've modernized things, and because actually I don't think it's possible for us to go back to an earlier period and think exactly what it was that people felt and believed. Maybe they didn't believe that stuff. Maybe they still thought it was metaphor, even in the 12th century or the 6th century. So what I wanted to do was to try and make those characters live and speak in a way that, you or I might speak. And so I've been doing that. Things that I've missed out, and particularly when I've been talking about ballads, child ballads and folklore, I realised that as I reread the child ballads, and there are 300 odd of them, and they are unspeakably misogynistic and brutal to women. And so what I started to do was flip them, gender flip them, mess around with them, try to give some agency to all these terrible, abused characters who are just so sad and unhappy. And so we've got, again, highly modernized versions of them coming out in my stories. And I've messed around and taken liberties with them because we're allowed to, because there are stories, but also because we would not want to hear them in that form, most of us.
So when you said fanfic, actually, I really love that idea, because a lot of Chinese mythology, I think, comes from, for example, Shioji, which is Journey to the West. It's about Monkey King. That is a tale, it's like fanfic about the journey of Buddhism from India to China. And so we have these characters like the monkey and piggy, and they are now, part of mythology. And Chinese kind of religion, mythology, a lot of the deities are actually, they will be humans, like mortals, who did well. Like the agricultural god, he was some official that was deified because people thought he did very well. And this is common. There are many Chinese deities who actually used to be mortal, and just because they made a name for themselves, they were elevated. So a lot of what I have in my story are characters, these people, gods, like Yan Luo Wang, who is the king of hell, has his origins in Buddhist lore. So, those things were, I like the idea of fan fiction. So in a way, I think my book is kind of fanfic, because we're taking the characters and giving them a modernist view, and different roles, slightly like bullhead and horseface are the guardians of hell. But in my book, they're kind of these doting nannies to the very bratty main character. And the thing that I don't address in the book that I left out is absolutely all of the religious connotations. There's no worshiping, everything is a functional, almost bureaucratic thing. In Chinese culture, you burn joss money for the dead, so that in the afterlife they have money, or you can burn a house or a car so that they have provisions. And in my book, I do have that, but it's an administrative thing. So people do it so that the souls of the dead have funds to have fun, have their last hurrah in hell, which is a hell version of Shanghai with all the bars and restaurants and mahjong halls and dance halls, and they have a good time before they have to go on to their next life. So.
As a, you know,
Can I pick up on a small thing? If anyone's as old as me here, then you might remember Monkey, which is essentially Journey to the West, and there was a translation properly into English of the text, I think in the 90s, and I went to it thinking, okay, I know Monkey is nonsense, let's see what the real thing is like. And it is different, but it is very, very funny. It's sort of surprising how funny it is.
There's a new translation, I think it came out a couple of years ago, with a really pretty cover, and I can't remember who did it, it's a Penguin or something, but it's supposed to be a very good translation, maybe worth reading. And then there's also J.D. Jang did a book called Monkey Around, which is an urban fantasy take of Monkey being a shapeshifter. It's quite fun, maybe worth reading.
you were talking about sort of the bureaucratic elements. As a podcaster, I read an awful lot of books, and I'm afraid I can't bring to mind all the titles of the ones I've read, but I have read quite a few where they've taken ritual or mythology or something like that and turned it bureaucratic and red tape, and the rituals are part of, you know, the world order. And I think that's fascinating that in this day and age where we are perhaps more scientific, we've kind of taken something that is a mythology that is almost it's just, we've taken something that is creation and imaginative, and we've gone, right, let's slap some red tape on it and give it a really kind of logical reason in our current world. And I think it's both wonderful and kind of sad. You know?
Isn't that kind of what people do though? Like we come up with an idea and then we go, oh, let's make a business out of it. You know, like even with something like death, right? Like with funerals cost money. A lot of the things we do at funerals are not because they're logical. We do them because they're ritual, but they cost money. Like, you know, you're getting a particular kind of casket, okay, I'm sorry, this is very grim. Getting flowers, you don't need flowers, you know, to deal with a corpse, but you need them to bury a loved one. But then you need to buy them, and you need to get them from a florist, and you need to get a particular arrangement that says, you know, love you or whatever it might be. So all of that is like red tape around ritual.
Okay.
Sorry, just jumping rituals. There was a study, wasn't there, that said that the more expensive a wedding is, the shorter the length of the marriage. I don't know what the equivalent is.
They won't look me into weddings, those are all
don't know what the equivalent is for funerals.
It's interesting you talk about funerals, because when I was writing my second book and thinking about the underworld, and I had a look at different rituals throughout the world that people have done and continue to have done in the past, and I went, what is the point for the dead? And I was like, if you're dead, what exactly does transmute from the rituals? So that was one of the things I had quite good fun with. I don't think there's anything original in my book. Anything as in from original mythology, because I just picked and choose all the little bits I liked. But one of the things I did notice when I was doing it was that I had a look at why death came into the world. And if you have a look at every religion, this is a generalisation, there might be somewhere, but the majority of the religions I looked at, it was a transgression. Death was a punishment, and it was Adam and Eve eating the apple, or it was somebody else, you know, going, oh, you mustn't do that, and then doing it anyway. And I thought, that's really interesting that every single religion basically thinks that death has been imposed upon us by some higher being for doing something wrong. And I had a bit of fun with that when I did my dragons, and I was like, actually, do you know what? Maybe there is a positive reason for death. But I had to think really hard to think what that would have to be.
And interestingly, on top of that, almost every religion has a mythology of the end of the world, which is effectively the death of the gods. And that's really interesting, because everywhere you go, all through world mythology, there is always some kind of, and then there was a great battle and the gods all died, or and then the gods decided to end the world, or this kind of thing. There is always this kind of promise of that. I mean, even in Christianity, there is the promise of the end of the world. It's like, I can't think of an actual religion or a mythology that hasn't had that.
And the beginnings were very much the same.
Except
as well.
perhaps Buddhism, or various rarefied forms of Buddhism, but it is.
I found that the beginnings and how creation was created. So there were eggs, there was light and dark, there was seeds, and they all pretty
There was
much
a giant cow.
it was all pretty much the same sort of idea. This idea that things that we associate with birth now were associated with both then as well. It's fascinating to see all the different, how all the different mythologies all kind of have the same general idea. It makes you wonder, is that because there's some truth in it, or do we all just think the same way, or it's hard to tell. But I wanted to ask about settings, because obviously a mythology or a religion, or whatever you want to call it, it's very much dependent on people and the culture and things like that. So as well as incorporating the gods and goddesses and whatever, how much of the people and the culture from your mythology did you bring in? Because I was particularly interested in Awai's book because I really enjoyed it. I've not finished it yet, so no spoilers. But yeah, it was just like being immersed in a different culture and a different world, and it was fascinating. It was all really comprehensible. So, I mean, it's 1930s Shanghai?
Yeah, 1930s.
So how much of the real world have you put into it, and how much have you made up?
So it's set in immortal Shanghai, which is a hell mirror version of the real city. The 1930s city, I pretty much tried to make it as real as possible. Like the places, the street names, some of the shop names, the poetry, the magazines, the books, those were all contemporaneous, so they existed at that time. And yeah, I wanted to make, especially because the mirror version has, you know, these deities and demons who are going about their business and their ministries and being bureaucratic. I thought it would be nice. And also I really wanted to reflect all of the socio-political events of the time. So Shanghai at the time was a treaty port. I wrote it during pandemic, during where there was a lot of the anti-Asian hate and crimes that were being committed. And so that specific period I felt had a lot of resonance because it was a treaty port. The Chinese were considered not even second-class citizens, you know, like way down. They were the resources that enabled life to be lived very glamorously and cheaply there. And I wanted to make sure that that was also in the story.
Joanne, you mentioned that you changed the language, didn't you? Because I remember that about your books. It felt very modern and yet very familiar at the same time. So apart from language, did you change anything else? Or is it...
I think I changed so many things, but I didn't consciously change anything. What I wanted to do was to look at the spirit of those myths, which in my view were generally quite funny, quite irreverent. They had a sort of bleak existentialism to them, because with Norse myths the first thing you're told is that everybody's going to die, but they're also going to have a lot of fun before it happens. And so I wanted to take some of the humour and the rudeness and the very human characters, because one of the attractive things about Norse myths is that the characters are very relatable. You know people like this. They are not ideal characters. They make awful mistakes. They fall in love with the wrong people. They lose body parts foolishly. They do all kinds of terrible things. And I didn't want them to become these kind of elevated figures living in this place that readers couldn't understand. And so I just brought it all down to a relatable level. And so anything that I thought was just not part of the narrative that I was telling, I didn't include. And I deliberately didn't make it a historical thing. A, because that's been done so many times before, and it's been done really well by all kinds of people. I wanted to do something different with the voices. And I particularly wanted to do Loki's voice because I could hear it. I'd been hearing it in my mind since I was about 6 years old. And I could do it. And basically Loki sounds a lot like I did when I was about 6 years old. And I had a lot of fun doing it. But I also wanted to bring in elements of that culture, but not in a way that it would suffocate the story. I didn't want to obsess on details of linguistics and what things were made of, and so of course I had a lot of anachronistic references to things, and most people understood that they were supposed to be anachronisms, except the German translation, where my German translator sent me like 20 pages of things that wouldn't have existed in those days. And I said, it's fine, it's, you know, we're in fantasy time here, it existed because I put it there. And they weren't happy with that. They were also the people who wanted me to have maps. And I said, well, you know, again, we don't need maps. Oh, but we do, though. It's a fantasy novel, and so the Germans put maps in there.
Did the map just look like? What did the map look like? I'm really curious. Did it look like just Norway, or something?
It did not look like Norway. Reader, it didn't look like Norway. They said, can you design a map? And so I drew them the world tree and the different worlds and its branches and the rivers and how and they seemed happy enough with that. It wasn't a working map. It wasn't a map that anybody could actually follow.
I genuinely love that, because that in my first duology I was asked for a map and I basically drew India. I was like, please don't ask me for a map, I don't know geography. And then when I wrote the Jasmine Throne they asked for another map and I was like, I can't do India again, I can't do it. So I went, you know, I'm going to do the kind of map that people used to draw. I'm going to do a Jane cosmological map where you have the world in the middle, like the physical world, and you have like the ethereal world, and you have like the churning ocean of milk, which was space essentially, arguably. And I was like, I'm going to do that instead of a map that looks like a real place. And I had a reader literally yesterday come up to me at an event and say, this has kept me awake at night, genuinely said this to me, is your world circular? And I was like, no, it's not, it's just the way that the map looks, because I can't draw real things. So I have to draw like a chicken nugget or something. And I think that's all you need to know about the world building.
Well, what about setting? So, I mean, because it's kind of...
It's not a chicken nugget.
It's not a chicken nugget. Yeah. Are there chicken nuggets? Is there going to be chicken nuggets in the next one? Is it a challenge now to get them here?
Chicken nuggets into the new fantasy world. Yes, possibly. So in terms of setting, I think you're going to hate this, maybe not. I really like the vibes to be right in a book. So I wasn't writing in a particular historical period. I was drawing from early modern and medieval India and ancient history, but I wasn't writing in ancient history or early modern medieval India. And I think a lot of epic, sort of classic Western fantasy is essentially playing with vibes. But if we want to like mechanize this or turn it into more of a literary take, on a craft level, what they're doing is they're taking lots of different bits of history and lots of different historical narratives, much like Tolkien did, and saying, we're going to amalgamate these together to create a fantasy world. Vibes. So that's what I did. I took lots of different periods of history, because the mythologies that run through South Asia are very, very old and very complex and have very many different iterations depending on the geographical area you're in, the different cultural context you're in. And I took bits that interested me and I made a made-up world. So I can't say that the setting is like deeply Indian. It's not, because I am not deeply Indian. I'm part of the diaspora. I was drawing on the things that I found interesting. But I would say it was a fantasy world that was fun and true to me, much the way that I imagine Westeros is true to, you know, George R. R. Martin, or, you know, I'm trying to think of another fantasy world now, and I'm not like doing a great job. Earthsea, thank you, that's a really good one. Yes. Mordor.
Gormenghast.
Gormenghast. Yeah,
But that's a whole
Gormenghast is
dissertation about whether it's fantasy, but yes.
No, but it is all vibes, certainly, yes. It's a
And
great example.
incredibly true to itself as a kind of place out of time.
Yeah, it's like a perfect little sphere. It's like all like really good haunted house novels. They're a perfect sphere where you sort of wonder if you're looking at the psychology of the author or just a particular creation, a moment in time. Really fun.
Arguably, it means that it's the same thing.
Yeah, true.
I mean, I have a theory that Gormenghast is just a really good metaphor for human depression, and the whole thing is a depressed mind palace. But you know,
Oh no,
play
I
with
like
these
this.
ideas. Well, it kind of feeds into the idea that fantasy as fantasy, which has always existed, is just a kind of reflection of the human subconscious, which makes it more true than any other kind of fiction, because it says the truth in a way that we can understand through stories. Sorry.
No,
We've gone off. We've gone off setting.
No, you've made my vibes comment much more like interesting.
Alex, you were telling us about yours with being AI. So is it kind of set in the future, or is it current, or?
It's a long period, so there'll be a current beginning and then going into various stages of the future, and it's going to cross over with some other series. I've made random notes, but they're really random. I've written down chicken nugget. And because I mean, AI is one of those terms that I've come not to like for various reasons. Partly because I've just been marking essays on it by law students who have no idea what they're talking about. They're really talking about heuristic algorithms, but you'd think that they think the algorithms are conscious, which just absolute nonsense. So what's going to feed into that, what's fed into it so far, is really the totality of my set of influences, which is probably true of everyone, right? So I grew up in Sri Lanka. I came here when I was 7, so I'm in Sri Lanka, but I'm reading some kids' version of Mahabharata, Jataka tales, which are like Buddhist folk tales, but also Greek myths, and also random like comics and stuff, and it all feeds in. There's no, when you're young enough, and for me, even when you're significantly older, there's no real bright line distinction between them, right? They're all story. They all have value to you if they speak to you, right? And so what I'm trying to look at is what would have value to an artificial mind. And in my work, they are minds and they are conscious. They're not just your heuristic algorithms who are tools which are tasked with like data mining and stealing other people's work.
Sorry to stop you. Is a heuristic algorithm like ChatGPT and things like that? Is that?
Yeah, it's a tool, it's a learning model, okay. Right? I've heard people say they're not tools because we don't understand how they work, which is, I mean, it's true that I don't understand how they work, but you can be a painter without knowing the chemical composition of the paints, right? It doesn't make any difference, it doesn't matter. You can use Photoshop without knowing about the programming. Sorry, don't get me started.
I have plenty more questions, but I'm conscious that it is 22 and we have quite a packed audience, so I'm going to open it up to audience questions because I assume we'll have a few. If anybody would like a question, I'm saying that. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I didn't realise I'd be picked on. I was just thinking, at the beginning, you're talking about religions meeting, adopting each other's characteristics. That's very nice. If you were to like recreate that vibe in like a fantasy book, how would you write stylistically the idea that there are two separate cosmologies which are both true yet also exist simultaneously, but it's not just this one's here, because these people are meeting. So how would you convey that?
Yeah. I wish I knew. So I think that there's different approaches you can take. Like the question of truth in religion and fantasy is a good one. Like, is a religion real? Does it have like a real significant effect on the world around it? Is there a true religion and is there a false one, for example? Are they all false? But you were saying, are they all true? So the approach that I took to that was that they have an underpinning in terms of how they engage with the universe that is the same, in the sense that they all agree that there is some kind of accessible sentience or magic beyond the physical realm, and they all have different ways of accessing that and different ways of understanding that. So there's a religion of the nameless God, where they, the followers believe that you can communicate with this nameless, sentient, possibly agendered being that can give you truths about the future and about fate, and your name therefore at birth becomes a prophecy that will tell you your fate. You don't reveal until it actually happens. There are also people who believe that if you enter these particular waters beneath the earth, you can gain powers, and you can gain a relationship with nature spirits, but the cost might be your life. So all magic has a cost, is the kind of thing. And they all exist in tandem because they all kind of accept that the sentience that everybody's engaging with really exists, but it's not your particular one. Your one is the one that you grew up with.
There's an underpinning like cosmology of they're all there somewhere.
Yeah.
We like this one the best.
Yeah, or this is the one that I was raised in, so that's my one. That's the particular one that shaped me, so it's sort of tied a little bit with culture. But I think that you could also very easily have a system where everyone's wrong. I think that would be quite fun.
For book 2, I've got the humans and the dragons, and they each have their own religions. And book 2 starts, as long as my editor doesn't rip it apart, with the dragon creation myth and the human creation myth. And I did give some thought as to who was right and who was wrong, and whether they could both be right or both be wrong. And it is fascinating to see how two cultures kind of clash and yet also come together. And I think there's a lot to be you've done it. I mean, what about everyone else?
Yeah, I kind of did it too in different ways. I think we might all have done it in different ways. The thing that I'm playing at the moment, I'm not sure if I'll ever get a publisher for it because, you know, it was a while since I wrote my last rune book and my publishers have kind of forgotten that I'm doing it, but I've got this idea about Mexican mythology and Norse mythology having a number of intersections. And from that came this idea that actually it's possible to see all religions as basically different reflections of sort of Jungian archetypes, if you like, and reflected in different cultural ways through different cultural lenses, which means they can look very different, but actually when you dig down to what they mean, they represent the same general feelings and general sort of aspects of human existence. And so I've been interested in Mayan and Aztec mythology for a long time, almost for as long as I've been interested in Norse mythology, and it's I don't know how much you know about this because there's such a lot of it, and there are so many different sources, and the sources don't always completely dovetail with each other. So you have to look at, because it was an old mythology and it existed over many, many years, and it naturalized in different parts of South America. But basically, you've got a very old belief system, which is based on the idea of 9 worlds in the branches of a tree, and they have a thunder god called Chao who has a hammer. And this is so much older than anything that the Norse people could have come up with. And you know, I know there are a number of oddball little groups in Norway who feel that they exported their culture over there, and I thought, well, actually, no, that the time doesn't work out that way. If that happened, it's the other way. And so I'm kind of writing Loki's origin story and Odin's origin story from that perspective. It's very interesting and strange and messy, but it got me thinking a lot about how religions aren't all that different from each other except on a cosmetic level, and that maybe they are just all shadows of each other, fulfilling different needs throughout time. So there's that. That's what I'm doing.
That's what I mean. Yeah, in my book I mentioned Celtic mythology. Book 2 is dealing with Celtic deity. But in book 1 I do mention basically the way this world works is there is the Chinese pantheon, but there are many other international pantheons, and because it's bureaucratic, they all get together periodically at this international convention of immortals, and they deal with, you know, cross-border issues. So in the Chinese pantheon, you know, the deities deal with like how long the seasons last, how long fruit takes to bloom or ripen, and like, you know, fish, how many fish are we going to allocate for each sea and whatever, and when the storms come in and fog, all of this is bureaucratically managed by these different administrative ministries. And so it made sense for me to create international pantheons that do similar things for different countries and different cultures. So yeah, so that's kind of how I made them all mesh together, because they're all like cooperating together globally.
Brilliant, thank you. That was an excellent question. Yes.
Hi. AY was talking about
Oh, you can call me Alice. Sorry.
Alice.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said.
I didn't know.
That's fine.
About humans who become deified. How do each of you see the difference between human characters and divine characters in your portrayal? Do you try and give a sense that they are qualitatively different, or is it just in the attitude of the people that relate to them that makes them different?
Oh no, mine is equal opportunity. Say for example, Confucius, he was a very famous philosopher. He is also a deity. He has temples, people worship him. He is not in my book, but other, like the agricultural deity, he is. And they're just, they are ministers. It's bureaucratic. If you have a card because saying you're a minister, you're a minister. It doesn't matter what level or how you came up or where you came up. It's just how you are. So yeah, equal opportunity.
Proper meritocracy, isn't
Yeah,
it?
totally.
I loved the Greek mythology when I was a kid, and that's where it all started for me. So when I did my gods, I kind of had the same idea, that I gave them powers, and then I gave them sort of areas, like, okay, this guy's quite tempestuous, so he'll go off to sea, and they have tantrums, and they have jealousies, and they have human wives, and all this kind of thing. But they're not quite as out there as the Greek gods. So I have the All-Father and the All-Mother, and the All-Father does fall in love, but only with one human, and it's a beautiful love story rather than, like, you know, turning into a swan and all this kind of jazz. But then it's interesting because you have them two different. You have to kind of then put a line between them, because I then went, oh, you know what, they don't walk the earth anymore in my current time, because otherwise they're just the answer to everything. I'll just call them gods, whatever. And I know that Claire North did a good rendition of Ithaca and everything, where she did have the gods walking among them, and that's really fascinating. But that wasn't what I wanted to explore. I wanted to explore how the mythology worked with the ordinary people. So book 2 is very much, like I say, about the dead and the underworld, and how grave offerings make it down into the underworld, how the rules of the underworld are different, how it came about, how death is for various different creatures. So I mean, what about anyone else? How did you, particularly Joanne, when you've got the gods, the big Norse gods?
No, I was thinking about that while you were talking, and the interesting thing with mythologies is that it's striking how human most of the gods are, and when they're not human, they tend to sort of drift away from the narrative and not be interesting anymore. And when you look at history and the way history's been written down, the idea of history and mythology has only really existed as two lines of separate thought relatively recently. If you look at historical texts like the Codex Regius, and you know, you have heroes walking around with kings, and you're not quite sure whether it's supposed to be mythology or whether it's supposed to be history. And this is probably because the people who wrote them didn't really make the distinction. And so I'm not sure we can really make the distinction between the divine and the human, because the lens through which we're seeing it is absolutely human. And if we take an example like Jesus Christ, for instance, you've got this really interesting narrative that starts with the Old Testament, and you have this God who is basically, you know, I mean, without wishing to insult anybody, really cruel and petty-minded. And he worries about what you eat on a Friday and how long your pants are, and says that it's okay to kill your son if he gets drunk. And then all of a sudden there's this change, and along comes Jesus Christ with a message of peace. It's almost like a completely different narrative, which of course it is. And what happens in that narrative? The God becomes human, so that we can understand him. Because actually that's the psychology of it. I think we don't gravitate to understanding gods who don't have recognizable human characteristics. And so the appeal of Jesus is everything that makes him human. It's his compassion, it's his love for people, it's his generosity, his kindness, his lack of cruelty, his basic lack of being the God of the Old Testament.
I like an inhuman god. But I think it's really interesting how in Hinduism, for example, you have a lot of gods incarnating as humans, and now that's like, now they're a human, we can get them, we understand them. It's when they leave humanity again that they become a god. And I find that there's something almost horrific about taking a god and making them human. I find that there's a kind of body horror in that I find quite pleasing.
Alexander, do you have thoughts?
Just going back to the Jungian point, I think there's a sense maybe in which we make the gods that we need, both historically, really, and certainly fictionally. And tying that back to the behaviour of the Norse gods, I love the fact that they played tricks on each other, without it necessarily needing to be for a purpose, right? They just knew how to take the piss. Which suggests to me that that is something that we need, and which over time in religion does kind of get sanded away, and it can stay in mythology, and religion ends up taking itself too seriously in many cases.
We haven't quite got enough time for another question, either from me or from the floor, but we do have a few minutes left, so I will throw it out here. From your mythology, which is your favourite god or goddess? This is a spontaneous one. So
Anyone who's ever read my books already knows the answers.
I was going to say, I'm pretty much sure we're going to get to you. I have to shout out from my mythology that I, like say, pick and choose mine, but I quite enjoyed the Ballad of the Farting Dragon, where the dragon got killed by being literally kicked up the arse. I thought that was a quite a good one, and I didn't manage to work it in, but maybe another book. Anyone else got any?
Oh, my favorite is Lord Black. He's the Dragon King of the North, and I guess he's a shapeshifter. I don't call him a shapeshifter, but he has a dragon body and a human guise. And when he's in a human guise, he's like probably the most powerful deity in my whole world.
It's kind of hot in the book as well.
But yeah, he's kind of like an Adrian Brody Chinese version. He's got like a little bit of a hook nose. He's got like, and he likes to parade around in like shabby robes. He's like thinks of him like himself as a poet, and he's very infuriating. No straight answers ever, ever. So yeah, I really enjoyed.
I really
loved
liked him
him.
too,
Yeah.
but maybe for different reasons from you.
He's hot.
Yeah, that was my whole
He's
response.
more like the annoying uncle.
I mean, talking about being hot, you said human guys, and I did mishear you as having said human thighs.
Yeah, he's got great thighs, I bet, under those robes.
I can't think of God, but I can pick my favourite Tudor. Is that helpful?
Well, it depends who matches my favourite Tudor. Go on.
Margaret Beaufort.
Ooh.
Does she
and
count?
please.
Like, that's a very different choice. Yeah.
Well, she's the only one. Sorry. Yes, I should perhaps ask who was the hottest god in your pantheon. Given that we started with that, but I think that has used up our last 5 minutes. So we're going to have a huge round of applause for my fabulous.